That's also maybe how he characterizes a little bit of human existence too. Like today, we live according to what it means to be human. What is an ideal human being? How can we approximate to that? What is that image? Of course, if it is represented in a way that's different than us, then we get upset and they say, no, no, that should be included in that too. But even in that, there is this projection of an ideal human being, like how should I be is always asked by comparing myself to an image, rather than just being with others in relationships, according to which you can not only not answer these questions, but you cannot even raise these questions independently of your relationship with others. It would be problematic to say, like, how should I be as a human being? That means I cut off my relationship from other people, how I think those relationships with other people, and how I should be depending on the context. Who am I associating with? And then we are having all these kinds of different relationships, as I said before, then we cannot think of what our identity is in this, like a solid, like who am I? Like you are not supposed to be who. You're not supposed to be one thing. You are just these relationships, and it's completely different depending on each context. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of, if there's any kind of injunction here, try to live without identity. Yes.
I was reminded also talking about how in the translation from Arabic to English, English says that some like the vowels are missing in the Arabic language, but instead,
Vowels are missing, yes.
yeah, but instead it's just the letters, the way they're constructed, mean different things in different contexts. I mean, it's just an iteration of what we were talking about, but the idea that the relationship is what matters, and it's not like each word is the ideal of that word, and it means something concrete separate from everything else, but the words strung together create the meaning.
Sure, language has a specific problem or poses a specific problem, of course, because we try to formalize it as much as possible and claim that it is the communication for people. Like it's and there is that kind of scientific impulse too. Like if we can create a language that is representational enough, then we can understand something properly and adequately because there is something corresponding to that. And that's really like why we think mathematics is a universal language, because it is highly abstract, symbolic, therefore it can't be shared by anybody, and it correctly represents nature. The simpler it is, the more correctly it will represent nature. And that desire, while if you understand truth as accuracy, as precision, might very well be useful, but it doesn't really speak to the phenomenological content of our relationship to the world. Because I don't, like mathematics is, as I mean, it's pretty obvious that it is very much distant from my relationship with the world and with other people. Now I can formalize that relationship and try to make it correct and not like, I don't know what would that mean in everyday life, but it definitely creates a power relation among human beings that somehow suggests that some are closer to the accurate representation of an ideality that some aren't. Hence, the savages, the primitives, the pre-moderns are not just underdeveloped, they are just wrong. They are false. Their existence is false. Like they live a mistake, they live an error. That's our conception of ourselves, because we know how to live, and they don't. They are wrong. and therefore they are weak, therefore they are going to die. So like, this is really our conception of other cultures. Like, we never really thought that there was anything wrong with us under Trump, but there is something like, because there was like bad administration, etc. But whatever is happening in India now, it's like, oh, they are just like living falsely. It's the same model, same number of people, maybe a little bit more because there are like more than 1 billion people. And but our conception of India is now, from the perspective of like Biden is going to help them now, etc., is exactly the same. Like, they are living falsely. Not there's a mismanagement, that there's a political problem, etc. Their way of being is problematic. That's how we represent the other guy. And we, I mean, I suspect that you actually believe that. I mean, I don't mean to be mean, but I kind of think that you might actually think that. You might actually, like, deep down in your like secret of your thoughts, you think that. Like, some of you I know, you think that you live properly. You are correct. You are exemplifying the best way of being in the world, and some other people who have false opinion and false political or scientific opinions are false, and their way of being is wrong. Of course, I won't bring that up, like accuse you, but I'm just saying, yeah.
Is it possible to think that you are living the best way for yourself without the negation of the other? Like, without, like, not necessarily in terms of the way other people are living, but this is what works for the individual. This is what works for me.
Sure. I mean, you want to have your cake and eat it too, I suppose. Like, I want to be both living the best life and not think that and feel that I have this superiority complex. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I believe not, because like, what do you say? Like, when you say like, this is the greatest nation, but I don't mean the others aren't great. It's like, nah, I think you kind of mean that, like when you say that. And when you say like, oh, this is the best life, that's for me, but you go like live whatever life you want, that would be equally possible. I don't know. I mean, maybe in a sort of very personal way with another person, you can do that, but politically, economically, that would be hard to imagine. Because then we have to compete too, in a way that you say like, I should get that grant and not you, because my proposal is better because I'm better than you. I mean, this is really what sort of capitalism pushes you to think too. Like, you come to school, you not like you are competing. Of course, I told them you never compete with other people. You will never say that, blah, blah. But there is this underlying structure in which you are fighting for resources. That's what we do all the time. So this is not like, I'm not suggesting like, don't do it. I'm not saying like, be a good person and not do it, or be even a better person than a good person and don't present yourself as a good person or anything like that. It's just like, this is life for us. This is how we live. Like, you know, I want a job, you want a job, you want to get something, you want to have certain aspects and resources of the society, and we are literally played against each other. So again, I hope like you don't understand anything I say as a kind of criticism of how you should live or something like that. It's just that that's what for you to decide. But even with respect to certain things I say, like identity, of course you have that image of yourself. Of course you interact with other people. Of course you think that you are trying to control your perception of other people's perception of you. We are inevitably going to do that because we live in this world with this structure. Just because we recognize it doesn't mean we escape it. In fact, that really doesn't happen. Just like when you name certain emotion doesn't mean that you master it. Yeah.
So I have a question about like falsehood and like truth and like
Yes, falsehood and whatnot.
uncertainty, yeah, but like in relation to at least like the the problem is ascribing like truth value to ways of being, or like truth values themselves. If that's the question.
Well, it's the nature of truth. Scientific truth, representational truth, representing something correctly, adequately, suggests also that there is an inherent reality in it that can be represented. And that becomes the conception of truth, a sort of correspondence. So when I say something like, Egyptians are XYZ, this statement may be false or true, right? If this statement can be false or true, it's either going to be true according to some conception of Egyptians who are like that, and it will be false according to some other conception of Egyptians who are not like that. The question here is making a statement like that already suggests that there must be something according to which you can decide whether this is true or not. That's the problem. So mathematics is also like that. Like, is 2 + 2 is 4 or not? Oh, it is. That presupposes the nature can be understood in terms of 2 + 2 is 4 or not. That's the kind of representational structure. That's the effect of representation. It creates this truth value, truth effect. Then you have to say, this is either true or false. What I'm trying to do is to question that very assertion itself. Should you make statements like that? And if you do, what effect does it have? And you start believing that there is an essential Egyptianness according to which you can determine the veracity of these statements. That's the problem. Now, you will say, do you mean there is no essential Egyptianness? Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. There is no, because that's a concept. And we sort of reify that concept and try to think as if that concept has an essential reality. And that's what concepts do. Because if they become representational concepts, then they try to freeze and somehow solidify, petrify what it purports to represent. And you can read concepts differently. You can say, well, if Egyptian is a concept, it's more of a Hegelian concept. Namely, it can have both XYZ and not XYZ in it. Hence, you cannot rely on one or the other. Yes, Egyptians might be industrious. Egyptians can also be lazy. Both are true in opposition to each other because that is contained within the concept of Egyptian. So like backwards, that's the thing, like on the last 169. I'll just give that as an example. On page 169, our present backwardness. This is sort of self-conception of Egyptians. How we come to be regarded as part of the Orient. Now you start believing that there is an Orient. Now you understand yourself like, I am Oriental. I am from the Orient. Just like some of you believe that, oh, I am from East Asia, or I am from Latin America, these are all like, I don't want to say false because it would play into the same problem, but they are problematic. Like, I'm African. Like, what does that mean? Like you identify with that. Then it says, ask the reader who wrote to the Egyptian journal Al-Mukatafa in 1888. Are we not closer to Europe than China or North Africa? Now you are trying to situate yourself with respect to others. Like, where am I in the civilizational ladder? Right? It happened, replied the editor, because those who study us call themselves Orientals. But this skepticism did not last. 5 years later, well, that's a good thing. Like, they called themselves Orientals. That's why we are called Orient. So that actually makes more sense. Right? But then that skepticism didn't last, apparently. When he had come to know personally some of the leading Orientalists of the state, the editor was willing to accept the Orient as a self-image. That's really the predicament. Like, you accept yourself as, now, of course, in the case of colonialism, this is a negative representation. You are backward, but you can accept a positive representation too. Right? It is It is we who have placed ourselves in this position. So now I'm colonized, it's my fault. There is one thing that unites us all in the Orient, our past greatness and our present backwardness. Now, you not only have a scale of what it means to be at the civilizational ladder, but also associate yourself with all the other Orients from this perspective. Now, again, in terms of politics, in terms of economics, that's a very real impact because you are trying to participate in the world economy. So I don't want to say that, oh, this is a false understanding of yourself, therefore we should dismiss it, etc. This is the reality we need to understand, how you get to see yourself in a certain way, even though you might know that it is not sort of, I don't want to say correct, but not thoughtful enough to understand your identity, it's still something that you need to deal with. So I'm not suggesting like, oh, we should dismiss all these categories and pretend that they don't exist, etc. But we need to understand what they are. It's the same kind of thing with like race. When I teach race theory in like my early seminar, that's the question. Like, oh, it's not real. Let's dismiss it. It's like, you can't. That just because it is not scientifically real doesn't mean you can dismiss it because it has a created, not just false, but manufactured reality. And manufactured reality is perhaps the most difficult thing to get rid of than naturally occurring reality, if it ever exists. That has more impact on us. Like, to us, like categories of nationality, categories of gender, categories of sexuality, categories of race, they have like strong hold over us, even though they are completely relationally manufactured concepts. Yes.
Yeah, that's like that passively about like the whatnot.
Say it out loud because I don't think they can hear you.
The passage about like the editor being like our present backwardness.
Uh-huh.
And I get it like me thinking about the show in fact that like he doesn't really provide any like doesn't really demonstrate why those people were convinced. We just know like they were convinced of this thing, but there's like I feel like what is it about that particular I guess like narrative or that makes it convincing to some of these like Egyptian people themselves to be like, oh, like what like how does that happen?
Well, because you start looking at yourself through these representations. And when I say yourself, I don't mean like personal self necessarily, but when I read all these books about Turks, and then I look at my fellow Turks and I see them just the way they are described by those books, because I start seeing them that way. And that's a very typical colonized response to representations. Like, yeah, I don't want to be like that, but some Turks are like that. So I have this kind of paradoxical identity, like I am a Turk, but I'm not like Turks. That's where colonized finds itself. Like you say, I'm an Egyptian, but I'm an educated Egyptian, because there are not educated Egyptians. Because of them, we got colonized. Because Europe has a material, political, social superiority to us. It's a reality. They have money, they have guns, they come kill, like the British have at the beginning of the philosophy of the thing that, no, the other chapter on the machinery of truth, how British has this incredible military might that flattens us. We die, we are weak. And I accept that. How can I not accept that? This is a reality. This is not just pure representation of how I'm, I mean, that's why we make this mistake of like, it's not like prejudice. It's not like misrepresentation. It's not like Orientalism is a false representation of an otherwise wonderful civilization. No, it is a physical force. So the claim here is in order to be able to create representations, you need that physical power present over those people. So power always comes from representation, we think, but in order to be able to do representation, you need power. Yes.
I have a question on something a little earlier, like in terms of identity, like why is it that we try and understand identity? Like we acknowledge that it's more complicated than just being your own. Isn't like my understanding of like why we understand identity so that we know how to act, and isn't that things like the way we fall into like the trap? Then it's like, okay, I want to act like this category gives, like,
Yeah.
yeah. So then it's like, if by trying to understand it, we will end up falling into the trap over and over again, of like being on one side of the whole like oppositional thing. That's kind of like what I'm thinking.
I mean, I want to say even the very notion of identity puts you in this both sides of the opposition. So as a political category, it's supposed to create solidarity. It's supposed to create belonging. You want to belong to a certain and share the destiny of being excluded with other people, right? Like I don't want to be the only one who is excluded. Certain people share my destiny, so that kind of belonging, right? So it creates a kind of commonality among human beings, right? I mean, I want to say, hey, Turks here, get up, or like females or whatever, right? Then we have a kind of solidarity, belong together, creates a kind of, if not universal, this common trope. But on the other hand, it plays itself the other way too. We always invoke our identity in terms of our absolute uniqueness. It's like, oh, it's me, it's mine. It's who belongs to me. It's like, it's mine, like my femaleness is mine. So that's kind of the paradox. On the one hand, I want to say, yes, I am this like you are, but I am this unlike you are. That's the paradox. That's the sort of even self-consciousness having that relationship to itself as other, because I relate to myself as other. I want to be one and exactly the opposite too. And then you say like, well, we are all Christians, but some Christians are homophobic. I'm a non-homophobic Christian. I want to be a Christian. I want all that, but I want you to exclude you from that Christianness. So that's the sort of paradoxical existence of identity. And I don't want to say, oh, since it's paradoxical, we should dismiss it. But we need to deal with that in terms of relating to ourselves as the other and not naturalize it, make it permanent, make it essential. Like, you know, there's one way of being Christian. There's one way of being homophobic. There's one way of being feminist. There's one way of being man. There isn't, in fact, it's always contradictory. So that goes to Derrida's idea of, since identity is already severed, it can never be unified, it can never be one. We should not pretend as a political power that there is oneness. And that's the political implication of this. And we also like create groups, identity around identities, solidarities, political organizations, but also divide ourselves from each other in terms of those very categories. And then hate each other and start like, how can you do that to me? You know, betrayed our identity. And that's the most difficult thing to do. For example, like, okay, so I again give the example of Turks. I don't know whether you heard recently that Joe Biden accepted the Armenian genocide as a genocide, as if it's up to him, but let's say, okay. So as a Turk, you really need to like, what do you do? Betray your Turkishness and accept it? Or I'll say, well, I'm a Turk who can accept that, those other Turks who cannot accept that, right? So I'm already sort of suggesting, and then I'm sort of torn, like, do I accept it as a Turk, or what do I do politically, etc. It's just like, remember the end of that Avatar where that stupid guy asked him, like, how does it feel to betray your own people? How does it feel to betray? Like, maybe we should kind of like betray what it means to be human in a way to be just or adequate, or understand the other in a way that it is not available from within the group. So that's the tension that we all have in every identity, in terms of which we can become the executioner of other people. Well, some more than others, of course. I mean, given the context, but in principle, that is possible for everybody.
Wait, are you telling us
What am I telling you?
to betray, to like fight this problem, to betray humanity, we should commit genocide?
Whoa, is that what you got? No, no. As a Turk, politically, if I accept genocide of Armenians, I am betraying my people.
Oh.
Okay. God, Esther, we are recording this. Please be careful.
Free, why
Yeah.
is acceptance equated with betrayal? Can you just elaborate on that a bit for me?
Because there are a lot of people in Turkey trying to articulate this idea that Turkish identity is based on a certain type of denial. Because as Turkish nationalism was building, as opposed to the Ottoman nationalism, certain, like in the movie, The Battle of Algiers, certain people had to be excluded from that. And Christian Armenians were that, and Kurds were like that. So in order to create a Turkish nationalism, in order to create independence, you had to exclude other people and exterminate other people. And that's what happened. So that's the dilemma now in terms of Turkish nationalism. If you say that, you are going to be like, whoa, whoa, you are betraying your grandparents.
And so are you saying through that betrayal, you are like upholding the idea of what a Turk is and not like simplistic?
Well, I'm certainly not saying, oh, there was a Armenian genocide, therefore I'm not a Turk. That would be sort of the Western way of like saying like, I'm not a racist type of thing, like getting out of that structure, etc. I mean, I have a Turkish passport, I lived in Turkey, etc. So, but that means like, there is no one way of being a Turk. And parts of my Turkness actually contradict each other. But that's what it means to have an identity. I can never be comfortable with that and feel like, oh, that's unproblematic. And every identity, if it is politically exposed, has that dimension. Like, you are an American. I mean, what should you be? Like, not American? Did the United States commit genocide? Yeah. So what do we do with that? Does it mean one way of being American? No. Are you the same as any American who claims that there has never been anything done that is bad on the part of the United States? No. You're not. I hope you're not. So identity always has contradictions, always. And power tries to eradicate those contradictions and pretend there is one way of being. And that's what Derrida's notion of monologism speaks to. It eradicates contradiction, tries to eradicate contradiction. And ironically, in the 21st century, you can best eradicate contradictions by casting yourself as the victim. That seems to be the politically expedient strategy. Like you cannot talk about my contradiction because I am the contradiction of some other group. That's really not how it works, unfortunately. You can still almost always be both the executed and the executioner. Okay, that's a little dramatic. Maybe like oppressor and the oppressed. And you experience that in the colonized countries where there is like a lot of hierarchies. Certain people are still victimized by people who claim to be colonized and represent the masses, etc. So that's also part of the continuation of the colonial structure. Okay, I'm getting a headache. Let's take a 6-minute break. Okay.
It's more of an opinion question than anything, I think. But with Biden's recognition of the Armenian genocide, part of that was, I mean, he was using.
How did we get into this? Oh, yeah, you, Kate. It was your fault. Okay, go ahead. Any other question? So, yes,
Yeah, I have a question about.
I know. Go ahead.
So it's 150.
164, page 164.
154.
54, 154.
I'm trying to find,
Description of the political community as a body? Or-
yeah, so I forgot where the exact phrase was, but Mitchell talks about how like, political authority becomes kind of like mysterious.
Yeah, so it's on first full paragraph starting with this political authority produced in modern state.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I was just wondering like how, so the process of like mystifying like the political authority was like through the abstraction, like through the essentialization of the words, it's like apart from the context, and so that the words or like the writings can become apart from the author, and then it realizes the absence of the author and so as the authority, and that enables the I mean that enables like absence of authority, and the authority becomes kind of invisible and kind of like becomes like a conceptual realm.
Exactly, that's really good. Yes, absolutely. That's a great reading. Did you hear that repeated?
Oh.
But this is what they asked me, so you have to be able to do that too. Can you repeat that? I didn't get it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so should I just repeat my question or?
Your question was regarding page 154, how the political authority becomes mysterious.
Yeah, so the process of like mystification of the authority was like how when the Arabic like languages become like essentialized through the essentialized by like becoming apart from its context and its like its intentions, like all intentions of the authors, and so that like it enables like it realizes the absence of the author, and thus the presence of the author does not like matter anymore, and it becomes like kind of conceptual, like the presence of author becomes conceptual.
Sure, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that that's something that happens with the printing press in Europe. The nature of the language, in the sense, it is separated from the author's intentions, etc. So we can sit here and use language and try to communicate with each other, but there is a formalization of language. Whatever I say, when we relate to each other now, you will say, Ferit, you cannot say that. That's not acceptable. That's conceptually unacceptable. Politically, that, so I can say, well, we are here just talking to ourselves in this context. What I really mean, no, you cannot mean that anymore, because the authority of the word is separated from the author, the authority of the person who is speaking it. And that really happens with the sort of formalization of language. And we start communicating with each other, not in terms of a context, like we are here talking to each other, but in terms of an abstract language in which you will never look at me just like, oh, he is here in front of me, but he is formalized, representing a formal articulation, formal language. And that is extremely difficult in Arabic, he says, because that really requires the context in which this is articulated. And different languages have different, of course, different level of expectation of context, for example. Like I always confuse pronouns, like personal pronouns. I always confuse them because in Turkish, you really need to guess it from the context because we always use the same pronoun for everybody. So that's a different level of abstraction. What I say here is a mistake when I say it in another language. I make a mistake. Sometimes people think it's intentional or unintentional, etc. But something becomes a mistake in terms of a formal language where that pronoun, for example, is only guessed from the context. You would never be able to communicate unless you were present to the context. And I cannot communicate to that to a Turkish speaker because I don't have he, she, it, whatever day, I cannot communicate that. So I always say, I don't know what. So that always depends on the context and the author to a certain extent deciding that in terms of the context. And with the formalization of language, that's very, so we need more precise because you probably don't like, what the hell? Like, how can you speak about without gendered pronouns, right? I don't know, for those of you who speak English, it's like, oh, well, that's natural. Like, there's really nothing natural about it. I think it exists in Spanish too, with the gendered, like, you know, like if in German, it's even like the furniture and the animals, etc., are gendered. It's like, why? That really doesn't make any sense to me ever. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Kai.
So we just hit on the topic that my entire thesis is about, but it's actually, you even put the social gender when you use grammatical gender with German things too. So the social gender of woman and man even goes on to objects, and that's why you get it in different cartoons and stuff like that, or in movies like Avatar.
Yeah, like in German, the door is feminine. Like, why is the door feminine?
I don't
And
know.
why-
It's that way in French and Spanish and a lot of Romance languages because of Latin roots.
Yes, I understand that, but it's like there's an article. The articles themselves are like masculine and feminine article, like in German, which was incredibly difficult for me to learn as a Turkish person learning German. So
Yeah, so it's, people debate whether it's arbitrary or it used to have meaning. For each word, it's kind of different on whether it's
yeah.
arbitrary or not. But the meaning, the reasons people why I think it exists is just to categorize things and just a way to organize it even more, even though it makes no sense.
Yeah, like in high school, I always Das Mädchen was my like, why Das Mädchen? Why would you call me Das? That's like a neutral article for a clearly feminine sounding thing, right? Mädchen.
Yeah, and in French it changes to make it sound prettier. That's it.
Mm. Okay, yeah.
I was gonna ask, like, this connection that Mitchell makes between like the way people used to write and then political, is he just making a parallel or is he trying to like demonstrate how he's trying to demonstrate how like this kind of authority is produced? He's saying that like it's the way like modern text shifted in printed presses that allows this kind of authority to produce, or if that is part of the machinery of producing authority, or is he just making a parallel?
What do you mean parallel? Just like an analogy, or?
Yeah, it's like at some parts of the section, I get that sense, other parts, I get the sense he's trying to do something different. And then at times I wonder if like that connection is a bit tenuous. Sometimes to some degree, and I'm struggling with this particular chapter.
Yeah, the connection is indeed, I think, a little bit tenuous because he really doesn't want to make like the strong claim about like this is a exact same structure as the other one. He does make a little bit of analogy, but there's always the kind of internal connection. So the fact that printing machine is implemented in the Ottoman Empire, like 300 years after that it was in Europe, really speaks to a transformation of society, the communication with each other in a way that you didn't communicate. I guess what really characterizes modern society as we see very like clearly today is its ability to communicate with itself. And we always take that to be a positive thing. Like the more we communicate, the better. The more we have established relationships, the better. And I'm not really sure that in and of itself is a correct value judgment, or we should make that correct value judgment. That's by establishing those relationships, you actually create something like society, which Isao was talking about, this mysterious thing that it has to work in a perfect way in relation to each other, right? So that's what colonization suggests, like your way of communicating with yourself as a group of people is no longer valid. You cannot continue being like that. So what colonization does is to transform communication among human beings. So Egyptians, first of all, are created as Egyptians through a different way of communicating with each other. So printing press is one of them. And then they start seeing each other themselves differently. And that's part of the colonization. So it actually physically happens too. Like you create institutions. Like we love institutions. What is institution? Institutions are different ways in which human beings communicate with each other simultaneously and across generations. The school, the army, a modern army, modern school, standing army. Like Ottoman Empire didn't even have standing army very late in the 19th, 18th century. They would just sort of like, let's go, we are going to the war. Let's pack up. And then when you come home, like, okay, let's go back to whatever you were doing. But now there's an institution called army, which has probably historically much more significance than anything that happened in modernity. Like, you know, that we have standing armies. That probably changed more things in the history of humankind than most other things that we believe, like going to the moon, etc. I don't know that. Okay, Kai, sorry, and then Nola.
All good. I had a question. So in my other class, we're talking about the colonization of West Africa and French as a language of power, and going and trying to posit that into this class, how language has power. Is there a way to decolonize language in this sense, or in any way where it's like, it's the thing I don't completely understand myself of a way to decolonize language. Is that possible, or is it just throwing it out the window and restarting? Or is even me suggesting these things?
Well, decolonizing the colonial language?
Or yeah, it could even be that, or just, I realize a way to do it is to reclaim your own language, but even like decolonizing English, because that's when we also in this class is English.
Yeah. I'm not sure what it would mean to decolonize the language in terms of like, if you look at it like a natural language, it's always going to be controlled by academia, certain metropolitan institutes, which considers to be like what gets to be counted as an English language, etc. But we do have that kind of conception that French is properly spoken in France and somehow spoken in a less perfect ways in other parts of the world. And that's how actually a language carries the colonial structure in itself. This becomes a metaphor, if you like, an analogy for understanding language is an expression of those countries think the best, produce science the best, are the most advanced, more civilized, and others have some versions of that, which are not perfect, which are less than perfect, which is measured according to that standard. So like when you speak English, even people in England probably think that they don't speak properly in the United States because it's a colony. In Australia, forget about it, but it is spoken in France, in England most properly, in the Great Britain. So that actually, the way in which we understand language really reflects the way in which we understand colonial superiority. And which is the most kind of inescapable dimension. I can sit here and talk all about colonialism, blah, blah, but I'm speaking English. That's the reality. I mean, I can, as you noticed, like you can say all you want, you still have to express it in English. And somebody probably can teach post-colonialism better than me because they will probably speak better English. So that's the assumption, that's the reality, that's what we assume. And we do that too. Like, since we have this mastery of language, we can master a lot of other things within language. So that's a good analogy actually to understand the colonial structure and its reality. And why, like, even aliens speak English. Like, I don't know why they don't, like, they have a certain language of their own, but thanks to Sigourney Weaver, they start speaking English. I mean, not French, and I think French gets really mad at that too. It's like they're a little bit angry that they did not have the same kind of colonial impact that Spanish and English had. Yeah, language. There's a book that I should send it to you. The sort of linguistic colonialism. It's a little old now, dated, but might be useful. So what this book does, and I want you to get that for my purposes, is what we started out with Derrida in terms of a certain philosophical understanding of the world going along with a colonial structure. That is really what is most important to understand when we talk about why philosophy contributes to colonialism. There is a certain representation, there's a certain world becoming an exhibition, there's a certain conception of modern subject, starting with Descartes and continuing with modern philosophy, that enables a kind of intellectual background for colonial expansion. And this is a metaphysical, if you like, enterprise as much as it is a military, political, economic enterprise. And I want you to see that in terms of how Egyptians perceive themselves in light of this relationship to the other as the subject, but also this idea of the philosophy of the thing, how the world becomes, both in terms of its commodities, but also in terms of its meanings, to be consumed by a subject. That notion of subjectivity, the human being at the center of knowledge and worldview. I mean, it sort of like happens with modernity. Like it's not the God who is at center of the meaning now, it is the human being, but the way in which the world is organized around that conception of human being, the Western colonizing subject. And the reason I argue that we are still incapable of breaking free from these Western, European, white, dominated subject power relations is because we cannot think away from this as long as we deploy other identities into its stead. And I think that's the metaphysical problem that we need to engage with, namely, we cannot undermine power structures by changing the person who occupies those positions. And that's why we read Foucault to kind of separate power from this identity. And Isau's question was like that last time, like we like to imagine a person subject identity within the representation of power. And that plays into Hollywood, that plays into our sort of adventurous conceptions of power and undermining it, in the sense that there is that evil company owner or the sort of person that Wall Street, like if that person, and of course he's a white male, that if that person is undermined, then this is going to be over. Well, and more sophisticated, not to be expected from James Cameron, that company owner would be a Black woman. That would be the same structure that is represented by other, and it could be, and it should be maybe, if it is going to happen, but that's still going to be the same process. It's going to be still the same colonization of Na'vi people. So it is not the identity of the, now, of course, it makes difference. I never deny that. But in terms of undermining those structural power relations, it's not be predicated on identity, but something else. The way in which we relate to those power structures, not who relates that power structure. And that's the metaphysics of subjectivity that really needs to be unthought or thought outside or whatever it is, twisted free in order to be able to fully acknowledge the extent of colonization. Because it is trying to make all of us into those subjects. We are all becoming the consumers of meanings and commodities and identities. And as long as we are on that path, we imagine what enslaves us to this colonial structure is going to be our solution. That's really the beauty of sort of how colonialism couples with capitalism, in the sense that I present an image of a person who is heroically, triumphantly overcoming a certain thing, while that very heroic overcoming is the colonization. This is Jake. I mean, Jake, he's so like wonderful. He was this marginal figure being kicked out of a bar. All of a sudden, he's saving the entire Na'vi culture. What else do you want? Yes.
Cartoons that are about like a character that's like saving the world, saving, going into other countries, saving them. Is that representing some kind of bigger? I don't know.
Well, I think I'm not gonna, like, I don't know which show you are talking about. I think we should pay attention to each film. But this whole idea that, isn't it kind of like imaginatively problematic to say like, there is one person who can save the world? That very representation is so like both laughable, but also problematic and dangerous, in the sense that it's always the white male for some reason, because that makes money, I suppose. and saving the world, like that you can even represent the world as such. Like there is that unity that I can even imagine, that I can even dare to say the word world and I will save it. Like what kind of a unity of predicament are we imagining this? Like everybody is going to be affected in the same way by the same thing at the same moment. Like, you know, a nuclear bomb exploding, mostly for some reason in London, New York, blah, blah, places like that. That's how you save the world. I always concentrate on like, where are you saving the world? Which world are you saving? Like, where is that world actually exemplified? Nobody is going to like, oh, I'm going to save the world in Turkmenistan. I mean, the world is saved in London or in New York City or in LA at most, if they pay enough money for the movie. So that's always the question, like what kind of imagination is this that you can even say the world? Like when I think about it, like you are going to graduate in a couple of weeks, I suppose. There's going to be a virtual graduation and they are going to say, go save the world. World needs more people from Erla. Which is great. You should take that, be happy and proud. But what world? Where? Like Armenistan? Am I going there? Is that the world? The what?
The students are talking about is Japanese. And there's like, I mean, I think it's a trope that like occurs in every, well, not every countries that I've seen movies about.
Really?
Well, maybe it's like a few, like maybe two, but like in Japanese, like especially in anime, there's always and especially in like action driven, there's always a person who's destined to save the world.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm not familiar with the genre you are like sort of subgenre, I suppose, that you are talking about. I never watched any Turkish movie in which the protagonist saved the world. And nobody would take that seriously anyway. Like, have you? Like, I mean, it's always American, British. I haven't seen any German movie in which they save all the world.
I feel like that's in a way, like I feel like Vietnam also is making movies about that. Yeah, the concept of standard, like it's a narrative.
Well, of course, there are narrative structures, but since you mentioned like this projection of a world as a picture, as an exhibition that can be saved, is really a kind of colonial imagination. Like there is that world, like even being able to speak about the global village type of world, to have that imagination is kind of attributing a common destiny to people that people simply don't seem to have. Like, I don't know how people live. I mean, it is becoming more and more uniform and possible, I grant that, but still I think the world has enough difference and diversity that is not unified into a colonial picture that could be saved like that. So, but I don't know. I mean, you need to give me specific examples of films that, what was that, World War Z? Like I saw that, like this guy starts like flying around the world and saving. That took place in Norway, but it starts in Philadelphia. So, I mean, it's always this kind of Western fantasy about saving the world. I don't think like as a child growing up, I had any desire to save the world. Did you? You did?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you are more contemporary than I am. What?
I said exactly.
Yeah. I would be happy to just save myself. Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is like, yeah. I wish, I guess it's like Mitchell's same method or something. Like that phrase the other thing I think with Ali used to have in his background like that, right? Like everything is a commodity that even the gods are portraying. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, Muhammad Ali, yeah.
Yeah, that like, well, I was just wondering, just like the there be like Marx is really absent, I guess. In this
What?
Marx is really absent in this text.
Marx is absent. Yeah,
I wonder why, like, why does he do that? Like, yeah, just read that comes up like in the last chapter as well. I was like, this to me just sounds like,
Marx.
yeah, like commodities, we consuming not just commodities, but like meaning is something, like our relation to the, like this, but why is like the text is
Well, it's 1988, and it is a fairly orthodox reading of Marxism that is at work there. And Marx kind of, he believes, reduces this into a process of production in terms of which it can be explained. So I can understand why he is staying away from Marx to a certain extent, but that kind of distinction between also the infrastructure and the superstructure in terms of orthodox Marxism has, I think he does want to draw a parallel between commodities and meanings. And I think like how we consume certain meanings. And then it's not just sort of meaning of the words, but like you present yourself in a certain way. Like, you express yourself. Your shirt has a meaning. Your pants has a meaning. Like it always has this kind of self-expression. So human beings more and more live in this world as an exhibition in which they are both observing it as a colonizer, but also a product within that world. So especially like, I still find this text interesting because the meaning of the term exhibition is completely different when you are thinking about the internet and the social media, how you present yourself, how you have to buy a lifestyle. I mean, make no mistake, if you want to be a earth-loving, thoughtful, feminist, ecological person, these are the products you should consume. That's given to you. So you choose those, you consume those, and you present yourself in a certain way. And it's not just false. I don't mean to say like this is fake, etc. This is how you perform being. This is how you exist. This is how everybody should exist. We all have to exist in a certain way. And that makes a difference. I think that's very relevant that like you say, like, what am I supposed to be? Like, is my authentic self not that? Well, we don't even have any performance. Like, if you want to be authentic self, I'm sure that there's a app for that. I'm sure there is a way of being that too. So we live in this metaphysical world that we really need to understand in order to understand how we relate to each other. And I think ultimately, I really think of colonialism as a sort of a structure in which people relate to each other as broadly as possible characterized. Of course, it has its history. Of course, it has its economic. Of course, it has its very real articulations in the world today, but it is becoming more and more difficult for me to distinguish those between colonizer and the colonized. Yeah.
Like, kind of like going back to what you said about like the possibility of like diversity in the countries, like, or cultures like outside of the colonial picture.
Well, yeah. Well,
Like,
if you put it that way, that sounds
yeah.
that I said something wrong.
Oh, like how did you say it?
Well, because if you characterize all the others as cultures,
Yeah.
other nations, you have already defined them in a certain way.
Yeah.
So I was more like saying like this desire in movies, like I'm saving the world. That's a projection of a world that cannot contain itself. Like that world is a contradiction because there is no unity of the world. Certain parts of the world contradict each other. It's not in Philadelphia. It's not in white male world. that we are gonna be saved.
So it's like acknowledging the possibility of like otherness outside of the picture, right? Like without like using the notion created by the European
Yes,
West, like Eurocentric.
exactly.
Like,
And that's in the future, not in the past.
yeah, so I'm just kind of like wondering like whether that it does kind of align with Derrida's like idea of like heterogeneity of
Yes.
the languages.
Yes, it does. Very good. Good observation. Absolutely, yes. Definitely. And it's not a heterogeneity that exists, pre-exists modernity. It's not like going back to some kind of primitive romantic relationship to the world in which you put your hair on earth and it becomes an instant connection, or some kind of like bizarre fetishization, but it's a different relationship to each other. Okay, so on Wednesday, we are going to do to chapter 5 and 6 what we did to chapter 1 and 2. So I want you to, and some of you didn't even respond, like give your questions to me from the last assignment. But since it was the last assignment, I'm not gonna insist on that, but I need you to prepare questions for the machinery of truth and the philosophy of the thing. So that's chapter 5 and 6. It's the same. It's our last day on Timothy Mitchell. I want to cover as much material as possible for us to discuss and explain, but I want it to come from you. So you need to prepare those questions and come to class. And actually, like if you write them down and share them with each other in writing, that would be even better, because when you say it in class, sometimes we have hard time following it. So before Wednesday's class at 1, please send your questions to me via email so that I have all the questions that we are going to discuss in class. Okay? Clear? Yes.
Would it be